Welcome to the sixth segment of our Health Equity Basics Learning Series. This program is brought to you by our regional chronic disease collaborative partners in Alaska, Hawaii, Montana, and Wyoming. This segment covers the concept of bias and how it affects health equity. Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. Everyone has some level of bias. Some we are aware of, and some we are not. When working to advance health equity, knowing and addressing our biases will help us identify and promote fair and unprejudiced behavior and practices. Stereotypes are generalizations about a group or individual based on our assumptions. Bias is when we act on these assumptions, even when they are not supported by fact or evidence. Implicit bias, sometimes called implicit prejudice or implicit attitudes, are a collection of associations that emerge automatically or unconsciously when we encounter an individual or group. Implicit biases are formed over our lifetime. They can lead us to associate negative or positive stereotypes with certain groups, and this can affect how we interact with them, decisions we make about them, and how we treat them. Implicit biases are unconscious and can be either positive or negative. They can appear without intention or awareness and may even contradict openly held beliefs. An example of an implicit bias is when most people hear the titled kindergarten teacher, they are more likely to picture a female. Implicit biases are formed over a lifetime, but they can be changed. With explicit bias, we are aware of our prejudices and attitudes. Explicit biases are developed based on the environments in which we were raised, the people around us, and what was considered acceptable or unacceptable. Expressions of explicit bias occur as the result of deliberate thought and can be consciously regulated. The biggest difference between implicit and explicit bias is that we are fully aware of our explicit bias, whereas implicit biases may occur unconsciously. With explicit bias, we are conscious of our thoughts and choose our actions. With implicit bias, we can work to become aware of them and change our behaviors as a result. Here are some examples of different bias categories. These biases can be either implicit or explicit. Our biases influence actions that might be discriminatory or unfair. It is important to understand bias as a concept, but also to self-reflect, uncover our own personal biases, and learn to develop counter behaviors. Confirmation bias is when we actively seek information to validate our existing opinion or beliefs. This can lead to selective observation and not acknowledging or valuing evidence that contradicts what we believe. The halo and horn effect is when one's perception of another's action is influenced either positively or negatively by an unrelated trait or first impression. The halo effect can introduce bias into decision-making when you focus solely on one great feature about an individual and ignore everything else. Conformity bias means having a very strong tendency to go with the group or succumb to peer pressure. Ableism bias is treating or thinking of people differently because of an actual or perceived disability. Like other biases, ableism bias can be implicit or explicit. Affinity bias is when we prefer people who share similar qualities to ourselves. A microaggression is a subtle, indirect, or sometimes unintentional act of discrimination. When we commit microaggressions, we often do not realize they are generated from our implicit bias. An example is helping a person in a wheelchair get an item off the shelf without being asked. A person who prides themselves on their independence may feel more frustrated by than appreciative of our help. Assuming they need help is unintentional discrimination. Microaggressions are not always intentional, but it's important to be aware of how they can impact our relationships and our treatment of others. We should work to better understand why they happen and how we can change our behavior to get rid of them. Our actions and what we do with our biases determine whether prejudice is taking place. Keep in mind that everyone has some form of bias. Strategies exist to help break the link between our bias and our behavior. We can break the link between bias and behavior through self-reflection and getting to know people whom we have a bias towards. We can evaluate people based on their personal characteristics rather than those affiliated with their group. And we can explore our own prejudices by taking the implicit association test, available through Harvard University. You can find the link in the video description of this segment. We can learn to slow down, pause, and reflect on our potential biases before interacting with people, frame uncomfortable conversations around a learning perspective, and create a safe space for conversations about bias and how it affects our lives and work. In the next segment, we will review some of the actions individuals and organizations can take to help advance health equity. Thank you for joining us.